this is the money question in my mind, and I know that you've thought about this a lot. The
Mm.
Gilded Age turned into the Progressive Era. The
Mm.
Roaring '20s turned into the New Deal. This shit's going to end up somewhere, and it's not going to be where it is. Okay,
Yeah.
if we just project what is the result of all of this almost comical display of wealth that we're looking at. It didn't end well in 18th century France. It didn't win well in early 20th century Russia. How is it going to end in the United States?
It's such a great question. It is the question. And I'll tell you, the history on this is pretty eloquent. It wasn't an easy ending, as you say, for the first round of oligarchs in Russia after the Soviet Union. Often what happens is that when the leader, as he often does, ends up driving the economy into the soup, he starts looking around and realizing, hey, those are some pretty nice piles of money, and he brings in his own pals to take over from that first round of oligarchs. But here's the interesting and the relevant news for everybody out there, which is it actually depends on the public. The pattern is very clear that the key factor in reining in oligarchy of one kind or another is civil society. And that often historically has taken the form of street protests in many cases, or labor strikes, or investigative reporting, or some combination of all three. If you take the example of Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, it took 3 years of street protests, and in the end, he was out. In the United States case, this is so important. It was 17 years between the time that Mark Twain named the Gilded Age in 1873 and the passage of the first Antitrust Act in 1890. And so the lesson is it takes sustained attention, commitment, and focus. That's the takeaway. We're at the beginning of this process, not the end.
Yacht story is so illustrative. Rich guy starts off, he buys a yacht. Then he gets a super yacht. And then someone says, hey, this rich guy over there has, what do they call him?
That's right. Mega yachts to giga yachts.
Giga yachts, which cost over $1 billion, maybe. It's mine is bigger than yours. I mean, it really is so ostentatious. And that's not the only thing. And you talk about these rich guys who get the recording artist to come in at an exorbitant price to play at a birthday party for their 13-year-old kid. And people like Steve Schwartzman and now Jeff Bezos are throwing. I mean, I have to think the public is turned off by that. Maybe I'm naive.
I think you're absolutely right, Al. Look, I think there's something very human about this instinct. It's just magnified on a very large scale. It's not that different from the guy who goes out in his driveway and looks at his own minivan and looks at his neighbor's minivan and thinks, I might be ready to upgrade. Yeah. I need a little more. But there is a point. Look, at the center of this is the question of, do Americans ultimately want to eat the rich or join them at the table? And we know, you and I both know, Al, it's a combination of both. I mean, that is the core American idea, is that we really do believe in the power of being able to aspire to have that. That's what we are. That's it's baked in. Always have, always will be. But the thing is, that we are also deeply bothered in our bones when it begins to seem as if somebody else's advantages are so profound and out of step with history that they are actually standing in the way of my ability, your ability, anybody's chance of getting that piece of the American dream. I think there is a real ambivalence at the core of it. The most illustrative piece of data I've come upon in the last several years on is this key fact. 59% of Americans will tell you that billionaires are making the country less fair, and the identical share of Americans will tell you they want to be a billionaire themselves. And very often it's the same respondents giving the answer. That is just who we are. And I think it's a very fragile and delicate balance. And these kinds of, this is the key word, brazen demonstrations of a really historic, almost unprecedented degree of imbalance is testing and perhaps breaking that balance.
Well, I think these billionaires are doing damage, but I want my kid to become a billionaire so he can support
exactly.
me. Exactly.
And that's the American dream.
This wonderful book, The Dispatches on the Ultra Rich, You spent considerable time with high-tech people in the Silicon Valley and also back in your hometown of Greenwich, Connecticut, and Wall Street types. They both are greedy. They both like money. They both have turned too much to Trump. But is the culture different?
Yeah, I think the culture is the key question. I find that the most interesting piece of it because, look, we see that there are many different ways to be a billionaire or a centibillionaire. Look at Warren Buffett. He's on our minds these days because he's now passing the torch.
Right.
He has been very eloquent over the years about saying pretty clearly, it makes no sense for this country that I love to give me an effective tax rate that is lower than my secretary's tax rate. Good luck defending that, defending the logic of that. And he has also said, look, I have benefited immensely from this country. I've prospered, and I'm going to give as much of it back as I possibly can. And he and Bill Gates, of course, as you know, have really committed themselves to that. And I think part of this project, part of the point of this book, is to draw attention to the fact that that is a way that you can be both contributing massively to the innovation and success of this country while also making sure that other people are going to get a leg up when the moment comes. And we are seeing, to be blunt about it, there is a generation of guys that come after Buffett and Gates who really don't subscribe to that view. I mean, you've heard Elon Musk. He says the greatest gift he can make to humankind is being the CEO of Tesla. And that's a very different kind of thing. Leave it to Bill Gates. He put it best, as he said recently after the destruction of USAID. He said, the picture of the world's richest man killing the world's poorest children is not a pretty one. Bill Gates said it well, I think.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And, so much of these new super rich types have embraced Trump. They identify with his greed. However, Evan, in our capitalist system, it depends on a modicum of a rule of law, which Trump and his enablers have a disdain for. These are smart guys. I mean, I may not like their values, but they're smart guys, a few women, but mainly guys. Do they have any appreciation of what it means to have a disdain for the rule of law for them in the long run?
It's a real interesting question. Do they anticipate where this goes? Do they see the patterns of history? I think, having spent a lot of time with these folks over the last decade or so, talking to them about their decision making, in many cases they have these very kind of calculated positions about Trump. And you could see it right there on that stage. I mean, it is, without giving away any confidences, there were some billionaires on that stage who, some of them were ideologically very close to Trump. Others were there on that inauguration stage because they're afraid of what he could do to them. Some of them got off and almost immediately started telling others that they were embarrassed to be there. I think that they have a belief that they are ultimately, they're surfing the tides of what's happening. And historically, they've profited and benefited and thrived in a system that has a rule of law. And I think they now are at the point where they're gambling, frankly. I think they're gambling with the idea that they can ultimately ride out the storm and end up on the right side of it. Look, this is the problem of a country in which you have a personalistic application of the law, not a rule of law.
Yes.
Is that it makes the elite figures, the ones who feel exposed, it makes them bargain. It makes them say, I got to end up on the leader's good side, or I'm going to end up on the bottom. That's no way to run a republic, frankly.
Let me talk about one of them. You spent time with Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook. I guess it's called Meta now. I've been around him, I think, only once, never really had a conversation. So from that unenlightened position, I think he's a genius, a personal asshole, and devoid of any moral compass. Is that unfair?
That was about an elegant description. Would have saved me a few thousand words if I'd just come to that myself. Look, I think he is a person who was utterly unprepared for the effects of his own genius. Let's call it that. He came up with a big idea as a teenager. He turned it into the biggest company that literally the history of enterprise has ever really known in terms of its impact. It has more users than Christianity, to put that in clear terms. And yet he was not remotely prepared, as I've as I concluded from our conversations, remotely prepared for the questions of what does it mean? What is the meaning of truth? How do you defend it? How do you define it? What is the meaning of hateful speech? What are the origins of violence? I think he basically believed in one big idea, which was growth for growth's sake. The euphemism is connecting people. You'll begin to notice that in his language. He says we stand for connecting people. That means scale at all costs. And the problem with scale at all costs is that the costs can be immensely high.
Well, he did talk to you about his legacy, and he got a long way to go to follow in the footsteps of the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, or Carnegies, or the ones you mentioned, Gates, Buffett. I would add Michael Bloomberg to that list.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to have to change a hell of a lot, which seems unlikely if he wants to have the kind of legacy that those super rich have and had.
Yeah, I happen to know for a fact that he started out his philanthropy imagining himself as a kind of heir to Bill Gates, in the sense that you'll notice that Gates was a kind of a mentor of his in the early years, and you'll notice that he started this philanthropy. Zuckerberg started a philanthropy with his wife. It was very similar. It was going to be devoted to issues like public health and education, and over time he has just chosen a path that is farther and farther away from what that Gates image was. I think what happened, Al, having really sort of lingered on this for a long time, is that I think Zuckerberg was really scorched, and this applies to many of the people in this book. He was scorched by the experience of discovering that the public didn't see him the way that he saw himself. And this is true of Musk and of many others in there, that they become so surrounded by people who they have, essentially handpicked, who tell them all the time, you're a man of great things, you're making an imprint on history, that they just are often, they're really traumatized by the discovery that the public doesn't really see them that way, and that the public holds them to account. And as a result, they can get quite bruised and end up, as we see particularly in this second term, we see that there are a number of these tech tycoons who have decided, Trump is giving me permission to be put myself in his image more than in the image of those who came before.
It's also one of the reasons I think you're right that they like these yachts. They can isolate, they can get away. They don't have to be around people. They don't have to face criticism. It's a wonderful escape.
Yeah, it's funny. I write about politics and foreign affairs, and I sometimes ask myself, how did I end up writing a book that has yachts in the title? And that's for a very clear reason, which is these things are perhaps the clearest monuments of the values that dominate the landscape of our time. And I think these super yachts are kind of super symbols in a strange way. It's, they're literally pleasure boats the size of a football field that cost the better part of $1 billion. They're the most expensive objects that our species has ever figured out how to own, Al. I mean, they're more expensive than the most expensive piece of art, the Salvator Mundi by Da Vinci, which, I'll add, not incidentally, is now believed to be hanging on a giga yacht owned by MBS of Saudi Arabia, though we wouldn't know because it's not in a museum. It's very hard to check. That right there is an emblem of our time.
Boy, it sure is. You mentioned you cover politics and foreign affairs, so I'm going to draw on your expertise. There's no better China watcher than Evan Osnos, based on your years over there. Right now, the Trump versus Xi Jinping confrontation, how do you see it playing out? Who holds the upper hand?
I think that Xi Jinping has a much greater tolerance for pain and confrontation than Trump does. We've I don't need to be harping on the taco trade to point out that Trump has a pretty reliable pattern of performance in his negotiating strategy with other countries. Xi Jinping has quite a different pattern. He holds his cards very close. He does not make extravagant claims and threats and promises. He basically waits until the last moment when he needs to state his position. And the most important piece of this, frankly, is that he gains domestic power by standing up to the United States. It doesn't hurt him. What he gains out of it is that it enacts what he has always said would be the case, which is that there would be eventually a confrontation between these two. You know, I if there's one detail that drives this home for me, Al, it's that state TV in China over the last few years has started to rebroadcast these documentaries about the dark old days of the Cold War, when the Chinese people had to gird themselves against confrontation with the West. And one of the ways they did it, of course, was by learning to eat off the land, to eat tree bark, as one very memorable essay put it that was circulating on the Chinese internet. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure how many of my friends and neighbors here are ready to eat the tree bark. So I
No.
think that the Chinese are you know, they're digging in. And the question is, does Trump have enough strategy and staying power to win on that one?
It's also in the story that you know so well, when Henry Kissinger asked Zhou Enlai what he thought of the French Revolution. He said it's too soon. They tend to have more patience and historical patience than we do. Evan, is there any?
And, you know, look, part of it, you know, Al, the reason part of it is, look, it's a brutal authoritarian regime. They don't have to change government every 2 years, every 4 years. So, it's easier to have a long view. But we don't get to pick our counterparts. We got to deal with exactly who's over there. And the guy who's over there is going to be president as long as his body holds out. Whereas our president is on a bit more fragile terrain.
Put it mildly. Evan, is there anyone in the Trump 2.0 administration that engenders confidence?
That's a great question, and I don't mean to make an ostentatious pause here. I'm genuinely trying to think through who I think is done the reading. I'll tell you one person. There's an undersecretary of defense named Elbridge Colby, who is somebody who has thought hard about
Bill Colby's
the
son?
future. Grandson,
Right.
exactly right.
Right.
And what's interesting is, look, I don't agree with Bridge Colby on everything, but I respect his commitment to trying to understand the issues and to being devoted. He's somebody who specializes essentially in this question of what is the future of Asia and the United States. He's very concerned about war with China. I don't agree with him that the U.S. is overextended in Ukraine, but I think that he is somebody who is at least making a good faith, well-supported bid at it. And he may well end up being the Secretary of Defense if Mr. Hegseth does not prove to be quite as durable as he might hope.
Well, don't ask me, because I said back in April there was no way that Hegseth could last through the month of May. So I'm still hoping. Listen, this has been wonderful. The book is The Haves and Have Yachts by, I think, Evan Osnos. There's no better reporter in Washington, with a possible exception, no better journalist, and a possible exception of his wife, Sarah Beth Berman, who heads the American Journalism Project. So if we're putting a plug in for the book, let me put a plug in for the American Journalism Project that's trying to save local journalism. It's a great cause. Evan, thank you so much for being with us.
My great pleasure, Al. It's a treat to join you. Thanks for having me.